Let's look at what a lot of people liked in my book, chapter 3. Did the gospel writers know their stuff? We'll look at some of the evidence that you can find in any writing where you say, is there evidence that this is informed? So one very obvious thing we can do is we can look at the geography. Do the gospel writers know their way round the country they write about? So they write about Jesus in Judea, Galilee, and Palestine. Do they know the names of the towns and villages? So I simply made a list of all the towns that there are mentioned in the Gospels. And one of the things you see is that none of the Gospels have exactly the same as the other ones. And in fact, none of the Gospels can get all of their town names from the other ones. Now, this is significant because just at the very basic level, we realize they have a familiarity that they cannot get without either living in the land or having detailed conversations with people who live in the land, or traveling to the land for an extensive time. Those are the only ways you can have that knowledge. Because in the Roman Empire, you could not buy an atlas telling you the names of small towns in Judea and Galilee. And there are no Roman writings, we'll look at that, which would give them this range of information. And I go through that in the book. Again, I'd recommend that to people. One of the striking things I found in preparation for the book is the last column here in this table, or the last horizontal in this table, where you can actually see the incredible regularity of about 5 place names per 1,000 words in all 4 Gospels, which is not something I was expecting to find. They differ in so many other ways. They differ in terms of the rate at which they mention Jesus's name. They differ in Greek style. They haven't been put together by collusion. And yet, on this respect, they have a similar rate of mentioning of places. And what that strikes me as is something very natural that you might get if you never try. If you are trying to put in place names to make the story look authentic, one person will put in too many names, one will put in too few. The fact that we have this distribution is more naturally explained as just they weren't trying. All 4 Gospels mention Galilee more than Judea. That's not really surprising because Jesus acted more in Galilee than in Judea. But then look at this surprise. When we look at Matthew, Mark, and John, all of them mention Judean more than Galilean. And that is amazing because it shows you something implicitly about them. Matthew is said to be a tax collector in Capernaum. So if he's a Galilean, for him, the more striking thing is a Judean. He doesn't go around Capernaum saying, there is a Galilean. Of course, most people are Galileans. That's normal. So he talks about Galilee, but he talks more about Judean, the adjective. The same with Mark. Mark is said to be writing his story on the basis of information given by Peter. And of course, that being the case, Peter's got a Galilean perspective. He's going to talk more about Judeans. The same with John, who is a Galilean fisherman. Luke is not a Galilean, and he mentions the numbers equally. Again, it's the sort of pattern we would expect. We can look at the geographical knowledge of the 4 Gospels from the point of view of topography, where the land goes up and down. And again, this is incredible because we find that they always get this right. Whenever they use the verb go up or go down, they get it right. And so they will talk about going up to Jerusalem, coming down from Jerusalem. Jesus tells a story. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among robbers. Well, this is really interesting because whoever created that story has to know where the land goes down. And actually, it's a famous, it's a famous, locally famous area for brigands. And so it's really striking they've got that knowledge. But it's not just with the main town of Jerusalem they know that. You can see whether you're going from Nazareth down to Capernaum or from Cana down to Capernaum, the Gospels get these sorts of things right. So this is in John chapter 4. A man approaches Jesus. He wants his son to be healed, and he tells him to come down. Sir, come down, as he was going down. So these verbs are used correctly. Now, it's easy for us to take geographical knowledge for granted. I would challenge you to look at old maps, really old maps, maps that are 1,500 years old. Try and look at geographical knowledge and even maps that are 500 years old. It's incredible how wrong they seem to us now that we have Google Maps and so on. And you've got to remember, people cannot easily get any of this sorts of information. So this at least tells us that the Gospels are written close enough physically to the event to record correctly. It doesn't prove that the miracles and so on are correctly recorded, but it shows us they're somewhat close up. And that will be significant. We'll see when they quote Jesus. Here is both in Luke and in Matthew, we have a quotation from Jesus where he pronounces a woe on various towns in Galilee, Chorazin, Bethsaida, and then he will talk about Capernaum. Those are all in italics on the slide. And what we see here is that if we now look at what we know about these places, and we see that Chorazin and Capernaum are very, very close. There's a hill between them, and so you can't walk the 2 miles or over the hill. You have to go round, but they're also, Chorazin is on the road to Bethsaida, which is one of 2 places, but they're both nearby. This is incredible because in a saying which is attributed to Jesus, it's mentioning very specific villages, which someone like Jesus would have known about, but anyone who was writing after Christianity spreads far and fast, a long way away, is not going to know about. You can look at every possible source, whether it's Strabo or Pliny or Ptolemy or the Babylonian Talmud, any of these sorts of sources which might give people information, and none of them are written at the right time. The one with the most information is Josephus, but even he doesn't have all of the right places. So overall, it's incredible. Now, we had a question earlier, I didn't read the second half, about how were the 4 Gospels chosen as opposed to other ones? Well, they never were chosen, they won. A bit like when someone wins the Olympics, it's not that they're chosen to win the Olympic marathon, it's the fact that they are far ahead of everyone else. And sometimes judges might become involved, but that's only if it's a photo finish. In this case, the 4 Gospels are far ahead of anything else. There never was a question. But what we see is when you look at the 4 Gospels mentioning 12 to 14 towns each, you can compare them with the 16 earliest things which either in the past or more recently have been called Gospels. And we see what their knowledge is. The Gospel of Philip only has 2 towns mentioned. One is Jerusalem, which is the capital, and therefore not a very clever piece of knowledge. And the other one is Nazareth, which they think is Jesus's middle name. And so they don't even know it's a town. The Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of the Savior, they each have 1 town, and that is Jerusalem. And the next 13 earliest Gospels all have none, 0, nada. This is amazing because it shows a control group compared with the Gospels. The Gospels are rooted in the historical reality, and the other Gospels, the made up Gnostic Gospels and so on, are not. We can also look at the way the Gospel writers know the tax system. There is the story of how Jesus reclines and has a meal with lots of toll collectors, and that happens in Capernaum. But Capernaum is a perfect place to have lots of tax collectors because that is a border between 2 Roman territories, and whether you come across the sea or across the land, you're changing territory. That's in Matthew and Mark, but not in John or Luke. But in Luke, and only in Luke, we have the story of Zacchaeus, the little man, who is a chief tax collector. And the interesting thing is that he is in Jericho, down in Judea, and that is well away from Capernaum, but it's actually, again, on a border. It's the town you have to pass when you come over the River Jordan from the east. You have to come there to get, whether it's to Jerusalem or the sea or wherever it is. And it's astounding that when the Gospels have tax collectors, they have them in the right places. I look at Matthew. Matthew records finance things all the time. These are all finance things that are in Matthew and only in Matthew, who is said to be a tax collector. The parable of the hidden treasure, the discovered pearl, old and new treasures, the temple tax collectors, the man with 1,000 talents, the parable about people grumbling about pay, the parable of the talents, all of these sorts of things, Judas's money and what it went to, the Magi and their gifts, all only in Matthew, and even the bribe to the guards. It's incredible. These fit who it would be if it were written by a tax collector. In fact, I even counted the number of digits in the Gospels, the number of numbers there were, and found that Matthew there in the bottom left-hand corner had more than any of the other writers. I want to look at something just briefly, whether Jesus actually told the shortest parable attributed to him. So this is a parable in Matthew of 19 words, or in Luke of 15 words, that simply goes like this. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, yeast, that a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour till it was all leavened. And that's all it says. How can we have rational confidence that Jesus actually said that? Well, I'll show you how you could. One thing is that it uses a particular Palestinian dry measure. So when it says 3 measures of flour, and we're going to think about that phrase later, it uses the Greek word sarton, which is the equivalent of the Hebrew word seah, and a seah is a dry measure only used amongst the Jews. Now, this is a striking thing. I've been to America 50 or more times, and I've heard people talk about bushels in America. It also comes up in the King James, but almost nowhere else would people talk about bushels. In Britain, we have liquids by pints, but if I go to France, it will be by litres. Measures for liquids and solids change over geography. And what we find is that the Gospels use the correct sorts of things. In fact, when Josephus talks about this, he has to explain to his audience what a seah is. In fact, a seah only is mentioned in 6 passages in the Old Testament. And I want you to notice, by the way, the very first of these passages, because it's here in Genesis chapter 18, verse 6, at the first hospitality in the Bible, where Abraham invites the 3 guests in, and he says, quick, 3 seahs of flour, knead it and make cakes. And it's really interesting to me that all of the other times a seah is mentioned in the Old Testament, it has a different number from this time. This is the only one with 3 in, and it's the only one where someone is actually baking something. The others are for other sorts of things or for sales. This is the only baking example. And notice that word quick beforehand. We'll come back to that. But what this shows me, and I will put more evidence before you soon, Jesus bases his stories, even his shortest stories, where he can, he uses Old Testament language to put into them. Now, think about this. Is it rational to think the story came from Jesus? Well, it's more rational to think that than to think that someone elsewhere in the Roman Empire at a later stage made it up, put in a Palestinian measure and a bit of an Old Testament reference. And one of the things we're going to see is the argument that Jesus is the original genius who tells the stories. It's a far simpler idea than having Luke a genius and Matthew a genius making up stories that they attribute to Jesus. So one of the things we'll see is how this can be part of the evidence that Jesus actually tells even a short story like that. I want to look at a few verses in Luke chapter 16 from the parable of the unjust steward. What we see here again is the same argument, that the unjust steward goes to, he knows he's going to be thrown out of his job, and so he goes to the debtors and says, what is your debt? And in the story Jesus tells, the man says it's 100 baths. That's not a bath you wash in, that's a liquid measure of oil. And the other one says he owes 100 cors of wheat. Now, those again are liquid and dry measures, respectively, that are only for the land. So if someone was in Egypt, they might be talking about an artaba, or if they were in Rome, they might talk about, or Greece, they might talk about a choinix. They would use different measures. These are local measures that make real sense if Jesus said these things. So the idea that Jesus told these things is the simplest explanation. Now, when we come to verse 8 of this story, we see that Jesus concludes that the sons of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. That's an interesting phrase, the sons of light. And what we're going to see is, in fact, that is a religious phrase which turns up in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Actually, it's this scroll, which is called the War of the Sons of Light against the Sons of Darkness. It's a particular phrase which was being used just a short distance away from where Jesus was speaking. It's part of the vocabulary of the religious vocabulary of the area. And then we see at the end of this that he says, I tell you, make friends by means of unrighteous mammon. Now, mammon is a very odd word, but again, we see it is a particular Jewish word. Mammonas in Greek comes from Aramaic mammona. So you can only use this if there's enough local influence of Aramaic onto Greek to use this word. It's a particularly Jewish word for money. So again, it tells you something implicitly about who the author is or what their material is. But it uses this phrase, mammon of unrighteousness. And the interesting thing there is, again, that basic phrase, not mammon of unrighteousness, but wealth of unrighteousness, is attested in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's a particular local way of talking. So what we can say is, as we go through just this bit of Luke chapter 16, we can see within 5 verses 4 very clear indices of local flavor. And that would be incredibly hard to come by if you were not from the land. Now you could say, okay, so someone local made up the story and said Jesus said it. We're going to see the problem with that is you have to make that local person into a genius who somehow manages to persuade early Christians to believe that that's what Jesus said. And that's a far more complicated way of dealing with things. So just to conclude, all of these things come together. We've got lots of patterns of evidence, and it's far more likely that this comes from Jesus than any other alternative. I'd also want to say that the fact that these are Palestinian indicators also is a good evidence for early date. Of course, the land kept continuing in the 2nd and 3rd century, but Christianity's center of gravity moved. When you look at the apocryphal gospels and texts from the 2nd and 3rd century, you will find they just do not have these sorts of traits. So this is an evidence not just of the time, of the area the material is coming from, but of the time it's coming from. So I'm going to go on from that and now to a bit more Q&A. And again, I just need to get my screen set up for that. And we'll go over into the chat. So I just need to stop sharing my screen and then hopefully it'll all come back. Good. So I was asking, whether I consider the Testimonium Flavianum, which is the longer text by Josephus, to be an independent source of the life of Jesus. And the answer is yes, I do. And people have written at length of that. I was trying to write a short book and just didn't want to have to get involved in the long discussion which is around that passage. Now, regarding the bit on the age and completeness of the Gospels, how can we be sure that the authors of the Gospels didn't omit less favourable bits of Jesus's life? Really interesting question. But I'm fascinated by the phraseology. How can we be sure that? Because how can you be sure of anything? How can you be sure your spouse isn't cheating on you? How can you be sure your tax advisor isn't, how can you be sure of things? And of course, we are sure often of things. We are sure of people. We trust people. But we're constantly asking this question of trust. And my argument is this. In your friendships, in your family, in your work, you are making decisions about trust the whole time. And you can get those wrong. And people can be betrayed, and it's terrible. That's why a betrayal of trust is so terrible, because people have given so much in that trusting relationship. That's why it hurts more than almost anything we can imagine. A betrayal of trust, it's huge, because we stake our lives on other people. But we can't avoid that. We can't avoid doing that. So my argument would be that it's really the same way as we would look at other things. We're presented with a choice of whether to trust. So John's gospel says, I am telling you about the word of God who came from heaven to earth to tell us about who God is. And what you can't do is say, well, I don't care about that. You can either reject the testimony or you accept it. So there isn't really that in-between bit where you might say, well, I accept half of it and not the other bit. I know there are people who try that, but it doesn't really work in relational terms because of the stakes which are raised by the Gospels. So how can we be sure they haven't omitted less favorable bits of Jesus' life? I mean, I'm going to read a bit more of the question. If they were close to Jesus relationally, wouldn't they have a motive to paint him in an optimal light? Well, again, looking at what they say, Matthew and Mark have Jesus dying, saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? I mean, why would you write a biography of your friend like that? Luke has similarly embarrassing things. John likewise. I wonder why people would do that. If the records of the various emperors were skewed in this manner, wouldn't it be possible that the records of Jesus were skewed in this way as well? Of course, sources can be skewed. My argument is based on the internal evidence, and we'll build up the argument over more time. Based on the internal evidence, there's strong evidence that these are reliable, that you can, the simplest explanation is that they are true, that the more complex explanations are going to be trying to explain the same data without that. But it's not a question of coercive certainty. So that verse I shared from John 12, verse 28, where God spoke from heaven and some people said it thundered. And no doubt you could say, well, how can we be sure that wasn't thunder? And actually God presents evidence such as that. And every day we decide to trust people. People entrust themselves to romantic relationships, often on the basis of tiny amounts of evidence. And then suddenly when it comes to the God of the universe, they want a very different amount. And it might sound reasonable because they say, well, the stakes are very high. But actually what happens is there's an inconsistency there because we generally aren't asking for anything like the same amount of evidence for alternative views. So no one asked for evidence that going out and just pleasing themselves is a good thing. They say, oh, well, obviously it is. Well, hang on. Do you have evidence that that is really not, for instance, it might be displeasing someone who had given you the ability to do that. And people don't, there's an inconsistency in terms of the amount of evidence people expect. My understanding is that the letters of Paul were set down earlier than the Gospels. Could you speak to Paul's knowledge of Jesus's acts as earlier evidence of the trustworthiness of the Gospels? So yes, some people, many people think that the letters were written earlier than the Gospels. There's nothing in the New Testament that compels us to conclude that. The letters are relatively short, so the absence of mention of the Gospels doesn't have to be significant. Some people think there are mentions of the Gospels in the letters, but David Wenham has written particularly about references to the life of Jesus in the letters of Paul, and in 1 Corinthians 7 we seem to have pretty clear references to his teaching. I think when you look in more detail at Paul, you get that. Your view on the validity of the claim that the Gospels are a particular type of literature, viz. Historical biographies, and thus, as was the fashion of such, the Gospel writers play loosely with facts, order of occurrences. I am thinking of Kena's Christobiography, Licona's, where why are there differences between the Gospels? Lydia McGrew's rebuttal, okay, which I happen to write a commendation of. So you may get some sense of that. The Gospels are Gospels. They have analogy with Roman biographies. There's lots of similarity, but there was no temple you could go to in Rome which gave you on the wall a list of all of the things that the genre of a biography needed to be. So biographies are, it's not a absolutely tight sort of genre. And the Gospels have partake of more than one type of literature. One of the things that the Gospels do is they partake of biblical literature as a wider category. So Matthew is saying, I'm something like Genesis with my genealogy. And John is saying, I'm something like Genesis with my grand beginning. So although they have analogies with Roman biographies, they're not completely the same. And I know some people have done some studies of Mike Licona particularly, of say Plutarch's Lives, lots of study there, arguing there are lots of different conventions that Plutarch uses, which he says are also used in the Gospels. The problem for me is knowing when something that occurs, say, in two different biographies by Plutarch, where there might be a difference between one and the other over the same event, whether that is a convention which was allowed and accepted, or just a difference which happens to be there. And so I would want to have quite a cautious approach before each individual literary feature is accepted as something that we know people back then used to do. So in other words, in order to show, for instance, that people might rearrange things chronologically for a particular purpose, or we need to have enough examples of that to get the quantitative assurance that that is the correct interpretation.